All right, so before we get started with Latin, I would like to go over some preliminary lecture notes on grammar. Okay, so the text that's going to be presented in this particular course, as we've stated already, is this Lingua Latina text here. Okay, this is the text we're going to be using throughout the course. All right, so we're going to talk about what Lectios mean when we get to the actual book. Okay, for right now, don't worry about it too much. Okay, just follow along with what I'm trying to explain. All right, the first thing we need to talk about is the Latin noun. Every Latin noun has three properties. Okay, the first of these properties is gender. Each noun has a specific gender assigned to it. There are three genders in Latin: masculine, feminine, and neuter. Whenever you look up a Latin noun in a dictionary, the vocabulary entry that you will encounter will have the notation that conveys the gender of each noun. Okay, it'll have an M out to the side if it's masculine, it'll have an F if it is feminine, and it will have an N if it is neuter. Okay. Another property that needs to be discussed is number. Okay, this is the simplest of all the properties dealing with the noun. This means that the Latin noun can appear either in the singular when referring to one, or it can appear in the plural when referring to two or more. Okay, two or more. So here's probably the most confusing for English learners, this third property called the case. Okay, so Latin doesn't use a particular word order per se. English does. So in order to understand an English sentence, the words must be in the correct order. However, in Latin, this is not true. What guides you to know what function a noun plays within a sentence is based on a case. Okay? Each Latin noun can appear in different forms. Okay? Cases are special endings that change the form of the noun and tell us also that the noun is singular or plural. So not only does the case tell us the function, right? If it's the subject, so on and so forth, but it also tells us if it's singular or plural. Okay? This is extremely important. We need to master this. Each case ending indicates the grammatical function the word plays in the sentence, i.e. subject, direct object, indirect object, etc. Okay? So when you're reading Lingua Latina or any Latin text, you always have to pay close attention to the case endings of each noun. Okay? This will help you to understand how to read Latin. So think of Latin as a puzzle. Okay, these case endings are the clues and pieces for you to understand what it's trying to say. Right? Latin is a language. It's meant to be understood. Okay? Moving on. If it is the subject of the sentence, it will have a different ending than if it served as a direct object. All right, let me just give you a quick example here. So let me just say up here, say Roma. This is the Latin word for Rome. Let's thicken this up a bit. And this is what it would look like. See this ending? This ending right here is what's important. This ending tells us it's the subject form. I know it's confusing right now, but just bear with me, just for example's sake. But if it's going to serve as a direct object in the sentence, it would end with this instead, the am. Okay? So the endings are what change in the sentence. That tells you what the noun functions as in the sentence. So make sure you pay attention to these endings of the words. Okay. Each of these endings are attached to the stem of the Latin noun. And we'll go over what the stem, how you find the stem of a Latin noun in Chapter 2. Right now, I'm just trying to get you to understand very basic Latin and grammar terminology so that we can move forward. But I will show you step by step how to break down every piece of the Latin language. Right, the nominative case. Okay, this will appear in the first chapter, right? In the first Lectio of the first chapter of Lingua Latina. This is something that we encounter immediately. As in any language, there are two essential components of a sentence: the subject and the predicate. The subject, all right, what is the subject? This component is what is spoken about in the sentence. Okay, so this is what your sentence is about, the subject. The predicate, all right, the predicate, this component is all that is said concerning the subject, meaning it gives us additional information about the subject of the sentence. So it's conveying a lot more about it, gives us more details. So look at these particular examples in English. Marcus slipped on the cement. The servant slept. In these examples, sorry, there should be an S here. Well, actually, in these example sentences, Marcus and the servant are the subjects. Okay, so this word here and this here are the subjects of each of these sentences. The information following these subjects, slipped on the cement and slept, are the predicates. Okay, so this is the additional information given about these two subjects. In Latin, both Marcus and the servant would appear in the nominative case. The grammatical function Marcus and the servant would perform would be the nominative subject. This is what it would be called, right? So if you're looking at a subject, it's called the nominative subject. Why is it called that? Well, because it's in the nominative case. Another function of the nominative case occurs when certain verbs such as be, become, and seem are present. These verbs are called copulative or linking verbs. Okay, so this is extremely important. You're going to see linking verbs incessantly or all the time throughout Lingua Latina, and it's important to master those now and understanding how they operate in a sentence. Okay, the nominative case and linking verbs. A linking verb is never followed by a direct object. Instead, an element that is equivalent to the subject follows, which is called the predicate nominative. So let me discuss why it's never followed by a direct object. Okay, linking verbs, well, let me just keep going. We'll get to that. Marcus is a boy. All right, notice this is our verb. Notice here is our subject. And over here is our additional information about the subject. Okay? But since we have this linking verb here, it's going to be something different that occurs instead of a direct object, and we're going to talk about that. Next sentence. The servant became a soldier. Again, we have became as the linking verb. On both sides, on the first part of it, you have the servant, which is the subject, and following later on, you have the predicate. The first example essentially states this: Marcus equals boy. Right? All it is saying that this is what Marcus is. The second example essentially states this: the servant equals soldier. Okay, moving on. Linking verbs tell us a state of existence, being, or condition. A direct object never follows these verbs because they do not perform any action whatsoever. From the previous example, Marcus is a boy, the linking verb tells us about the existence of Marcus. So it doesn't say anything about action. All it's telling us is a condition of being that is a part of reality. Okay, that's all we're being told with a linking verb. Also in this chapter, or this Lectio, I should say, the ablative case appears. It is used to serve a variety of functions in the sentence. So the ablative case can do several different things in Latin language, but in this particular Lectio, we're only going to learn one of those functions it can serve. In this one, we learn that it can express location in time or space. This ablative use requires the Latin preposition in to be present in the sentence. So notice this word in here is also the same in English as it is in Latin. Okay? But if you want to convey location, you have to make sure that this preposition is present in the sentence in order to do so. The ablative case, continuing on. However, here are some English examples to express this. Marcus lived in the forest. Okay? This prepositional phrase in English is telling us location. Okay? The servant fought in the field. Again, in the field is location, telling us where something happened. The name of this ablative usage is called the ablative of place where. Okay, so anytime you're describing location that is stationary, meaning there's no movement, you will use the ablative of place where. Okay, there will be an exception we'll talk about later in chapter 6. First declension nouns. Okay, we will see immediately a plethora or several first declension nouns in Lectio 1. Latin nouns are grouped into 5 different families called declensions. Each noun belongs to only one declension. In this chapter, or Lectio, we encounter many nouns belonging to the first declension. The majority of these nouns are feminine in gender, but there are some that are masculine, which we will cover later on when we encounter them. So let's talk about first declension nouns. All right. So a first declension noun, so let's just give us an example. So Rome, this A right here signifies to us, or tells us, that it is a part of the first declension noun. Okay, first declension noun. We'll also see this word for Greece, meaning Graikia. Notice again, this A here. It tells us that it is in the first declension noun group. Also, we'll encounter Hispania, meaning Spain. Notice here, this A tells us that it belongs to the first declension noun group. However, we will run into an exception, okay? And it's this word right here. This word is feminine, but notice it doesn't end with an A. So don't worry about that right now. Okay, don't worry about this exception. Just know that it means Egypt and that it is feminine. All right, so when we're dealing with how to understand declensions, most people teach Latin in the forms of charts. When you decline a noun, you put it in a chart. So remember we said earlier that the case system tells us both its function in the sentence and whether or not it's singular or plural. So if we make a chart, we have our singular column and a plural column. off to the side here, we will use nom to signify or to tell or to indicate the nominative case. In the singular, if it's a nominative singular and it's in the first declension, it will simply end with an A. Okay, it will end with an A. So I'm not going to go over the rest of the chart because the way Lingua Latina introduces it is very gradual. But right now you need to know that a first declension noun, if it's a subject and it's singular, it will simply end in an A. Okay, that's all it will end with. However, we do need to discuss another ablative, the ablative case that we did discuss. So if we were to make the chart the way Orberg does it, it appears as follows. So the ones we're concerned with, again, are ablative and nominative. These other in the middle will be discussed later. So if we're talking about one of these first declension nouns, all right, and it appears in the ablative singular case, it will simply be an A with a macron. Right? That line above it is extremely important. Okay, so it's important to recognize the difference between these two endings. All right, so as the chapters progress, we'll get to learn the plurals of these as well, and the other cases a part of the Latin case system. So this is what the first declension noun chart will initially look like for us. Moving on. Towards the end of this Lectio, we encounter the enclitic ne. What is an enclitic? Well, it is the particle or a particle that must lean on or is attached to the word preceding it. Okay? The hyphen before an A tells us that it cannot stand alone as a separate word. The function of ne is to introduce a question that expects a positive, meaning yes, or a negative, meaning no, response. Okay, so this is very simple. We'll encounter this at the end. But it's important to recognize ne. So remember, it will be attached to a word. It cannot stand by itself. Okay, moving along. We will also encounter second declension nouns in this Lectio. Most of these nouns are masculine. Some are feminine, and a good deal of them are neuter. Okay, we'll talk about the neuter ones in the next Lectio in a different lecture. Right now, we're focusing on the masculine form. Okay. So, we will encounter masculine nouns in the end of this Lectio, the very end, and we're going to use as our example. Well, let me just give you a few. So we have nilus that appears. Nilus. We have fluvius. All right, these are just to name a few. But notice they end with this us. Okay. This tells us that it is a part of the second declension masculine group. However, some of you are like, what about that exception Aegyptus you showed us earlier? Like I said, don't worry about that right now. Okay, just know that it's feminine and it does belong to the. Just don't worry about it. All right, so let's look at the chart of this particular noun. So remember, we have a singular column, and we'll have a plural column. We'll have our nominative out here, our abbreviation for nominative. Remember, we're not going to talk about these other cases. And the ones that we're extremely worried about at this moment is in the nominative and the ablative. And we're also going to look at a plural form here too, because we do encounter the plural forms of this near the end of the Lectio. So, if it's a second declension masculine noun, it will end in the us in the nominative. It will end in an I with a macron if it is plural, nominative plural. If we encounter a noun that is in the ablative of place where, which describes location, we will see it with an O with a macron on the end of it. Okay, so this is what we're going to experience not only in this Lectio, but throughout this chapter. So it's important that you get used to seeing or drawing these charts out to ensure that you're able to do well at memorizing these endings. They must be learned if you are to understand Latin. Continuing on. So this brings us to the last slide of our lecture. These are the books you're going to need for this course. I highly recommend that you need this book. It's needed. The book itself, Lingua Latina parse illustrata pars unum familia romana. Okay, this book is worth owning. I recommend the hardcover edition of this text. I'm not a big fan of paperbacks because they usually fall apart quicker. As optional texts, I would highly recommend getting the workbook that is associated with this textbook. It's all in Latin, there's no English, but you will get a feel for how to do these based upon my lectures. Okay, and I won't use the book in my lectures, but I will go over how to do them. I'll give you an example saying this is what the first exercise in this book looks like, and this is how you do it. Now I'll give you an example sentence that I make up. Okay, this right here is a good Latin to English dictionary, or vice versa. I highly recommend you get it. It will help you in case you've forgotten some of the words you've encountered previously. Also, I will attach a list of vocab that is associated with the chapter in the descriptions of the video down below. I will also post links to these as well where you can purchase these texts if you desire to do so. So each chapter has new vocab, and it's important that you master the vocabulary that you see in the first chapter because they will carry over into following chapters. Okay, it's not like they just stop using the words you've already seen. The book continually builds on what you already know. Okay, so you have to remember this is a gradated book, and it's meant to build you slowly but effectively into reading real Latin. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. Please subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed it and you liked it. Please leave comments. Thank you so much for your time.